me and Barbara know if there's anything going on with the audio.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming to this seminar.
This seminar looks at how we can use the RAG technique to enhance our reading of conflict literature, especially in the context of the Irish Troubles. And here I'm really trying to incorporate multiple theories by incorporating thinking about trauma literature, trauma narratives, also literary historiography, and also how computational hermeneutics can bring all these discussions together and how it's advancing the whole discussion. But really, this is both a proof of concept and also a work in progress. And I think this is going to be a very authentic as well as frank sharing of how an actual digital humanities project would work once we begin to engage and interact with data. So I'm going to share some problematic data, which me and my team has prepared because we found something from the raw data that we retrieved. So about today's sharing, as I just encapsulated, we're going to try to advance literary historiography a little bit. Also, we're going to introduce how RAG technique, by interacting with existing archives, can show us an alternative way of thinking about digital hermeneutics, and also how this is going to advance our understanding of trauma narrative studies. We're also trying to look at the poem's role in representing collective trauma, not as standalone events, but as a more interconnected and holistic narrative throughout this whole period. And finally, we invite critical reconsideration of overlooked historical events. Oops. Okay. Oh, it persists. Oh, it persists. It's
okay,
very very stubborn. We try to make sure that the image is not in that area. So just a very quick research background of mine. I came from a very traditional Irish literary studies background. I received all the canonical reading of literature of the European and English literature training. And now I'm using computational methods to advance literary close reading. I was trying to bridge the gap between distant reading using AI versus the close reading that we could do with AI augmentation and helping us giving a more granular reading of the text that we're looking at. And as an extension of what I'm currently working with literature, I am also focusing on AI democracy through building lighter weight models through distillation, and also pay more attention to how we can help sustain and secure as well as develop under-resourced languages and culture through a very mindful accumulation of data as well as acquiring data to train our models. So here are a few of my ongoing research projects that has influenced today's presentation in different ways. The first one is the ongoing project that I'm working on, computational hermeneutics through interacting with the Kane archive, conflict archive on the internet, which is specifically about the Northern Ireland Troubles. So apart from RAG, this is really coming from my obsession with understanding as much as possible about our text and not let AI taking the steering wheel. So the cycle and AI workflows for literary studies is me looking at Josephine Miles' case back in the 50s to see how she proposed a way where quantitative analysis can be merged with close reading in a meaningful way, and how that inspires us to adopt and develop an AI workflow that takes on that same level of attention to details, but we let AI do the pattern discovery and also other kinds of more distant reading jobs. And finally, this is a chapter being developed, bigger isn't better. This is arguing how lighter models through distillation may not necessarily perform worse than bigger, more general large language models, and why this should be the way to go. Because even with fine-tuned models, very often it's so heavyweight and we don't need all of the parameters. So this is where I feel humanities scholars will have a lot to contribute to, because as we select the parameters, it does require a lot of professional understanding of the data as well as the infrastructure. So these are the few projects that inform my sharing today. So for today's sharing, these are my aims and key questions. The key overarching question is, can AI-driven archival retrieval illuminate us on highlighting some subtle connection between a specific poem with different historical events? Does it tell us something new? And to that extension, I'd like to understand, how can we reshape the whole trauma narrative by thinking of this conflict period, not in terms of standalone events, but rather as a non-linear and non-static narrative, where poems, they talk to each other apart from reflecting on their own experiences. And also, I would like to showcase, and as a proof of concept, how REC can provide relevant historical context to illuminate the understanding and contextualized reading of poems, and helping us really rethink the whole literary historiography that we are depicting. So this is where things get very down to earth. Originally, the idea is to use a complete rack infrastructure where we will have the retrieval and then we'll have the LM to generate a response where it critically engages with the poems that were prepared. However, based on AI ethics issues, we consulted the director of the archive, and we want to just to make sure that it's okay for us to use the data. And although it was fine for us to use the data for pattern observation, it wasn't fine for them once they know that it's related to AI. And it's even before we could convince them that this whole model is going to run locally, therefore there will be no leak of data issue. And the reason why they had this concern is, apart from the understanding that AI equals to ChatGPT equals to data theft, it's also because there are multiple copyright owners behind an archive that has been contributed by different people. So this makes both the legislative as well as the ownership problem even more pronounced. So as a result, we haven't to date received a confirmation from the organization yet, so we'll be focusing on the retrieval part today. Nevertheless, we are going to look at a lot of the challenges and how we overcame them, and last but not least, how it can meaningfully enhance our understanding in literature as well as digital hermeneutics. So for those of you who may be interested in Irish history or may not know what has been going on in Ireland, so this whole project looks at a period in Northern Ireland called the Troubles. Now, allegedly, it started in 1968 and ended in 1998. But 1998 is really a symbolic ending with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement between Ireland and UK government. Because this is essentially a 3-decade conflict, mostly in Northern Ireland, between, very briefly speaking, the pro-UK unionists, who will likely be ethnically Irish, but who felt they want to become part of UK, versus the Catholic Republicans, who felt they want to be unified as part of Ireland. And as you can see in the map included here, it's actually really tricky because they do not have a geographically defined boundary between them. This is a really artificially drawn boundary, and that means physically they're not separated. but sovereignty, in terms of sovereignty, they are separated. And within them, what we see on paper is 3 decades of conflict, but really there has been over a century of conflict between the loyalists and the Republicans, as well as Protestants and Catholics. And Catholics were mostly Irish. They have been suppressed and discriminated against for over a century. So this is really a conflict that has been driven by political and religious forces that has been going on for much longer than this. So just to highlight how complex the historical context is, this is the map of a very famous tour in Belfast these days. It's called the Peace Wall Tour. And interestingly, the reason why I said the 1998 ceasefire is really symbolic is because up to this day, people still live in different areas depending on their political and religious background. So here, the orange part symbolizes the Protestants who are pro-UK, and the green part, they're mostly Catholic. And these red areas, you can imagine, think of them as the DMZ zone, where it should be a neutral zone. But a friend just told me who came back from the Belfast Peace Wall tour, they said you can still feel the sectarianism going on because there would be 2 guards who pass the people, the tourists from the Catholic side to the Protestant side. And these 2 guys should be working together for at least 5 years, but they have never spoken to each other. So they practically don't know who that other person is. So this is how segregated currently Belfast still is. And to further complicate the matter, apart from sectarianism, which is suggested by where you live, this is how complex the political forces that were playing during the Troubles. Now, this is the history of all of the political parties from the beginning of the establishment of Belfast, also known as the Ulster area. The red line here signifies the beginning of the Troubles. And as we can see, the political structure and parties really just multiplied after the Troubles. And what makes the situation really multi-layered is that we are no longer talking about Sean Finn who are very nationalist or unionists or loyalists who are very pro-UK. We have all these in-betweens. So we have different people coming in with different innuendos, agendas, which really affects how we understand the poems that they're talking about and all of the bombings and violences that has been taking place. A very quick example, for example, IRA is very often known to be the patriotic to some people, patriotic group that comes from the more nationalist side. Some of them consider them as terrorists. And the reason is because even though they may be driven by a nationalist intention, very often what they're doing is beyond that. So they will have a mix of people with different ideologies, different religious background, and political backgrounds joining these different groups. So this is the kind of data, the kind of context that we need to consider when we read the Irish Troubles poems. Now, for everyone who has done research, we have all come across the frustration where we cannot find the text that justifies or supports our research until we have read vigorously, and one day, on a very lucky day, we stumble upon something and that opens up and makes sense for the whole thing. Now, this project really comes from the idea of what if we could utilize what's already been available, and what if we can effectively query them? Wouldn't that make contextualized reading and research more efficient? But from there, I also noticed in terms of literary historiography, how we in literature understand history through poems or literary works. There has been a problem that has been around. Well, I probably shouldn't say problem, but rather a convention, and that is if a poem is known to be connected to a specific event, we will read it around that event. We'll deepen our understanding of that event. but very rarely do we do it horizontally. So this is the status quo of a lot of the literary historiography, and I really want to emphasize on how literature, especially produced during wars and conflicts, they're not only a vehicle or a medium of expression, they can also be a vehicle for changing and influencing how people think about themselves culturally and historical consciousness. So these works are not only inspired by a certain event, they also go on to reflect and speak for and about later events. So this is the kinds of linear literary historiography that I was referring to. There are two kinds of linearity in this kind of reading. The first is if the name of the poem is explicitly about a certain event, or if we know that this work is inspired by a specific event, all of the analysis will be focused on this context. So, for example, Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy, we know it's about the Peterloo Massacre, so scholars will look at the massacre. And also for Yeats, Easter 1916, it's obviously about the Easter Rising, so a lot of discussion has been put onto the Easter Rising. But interestingly, it wasn't published until 1920. Another kind of linearity is if we know that a specific poem is inspired by a prolonged event, then we'll read it in the context of that event in a very vague way. For example, Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, inspired by the Crimean War. We'll think of Crimean War as a very vague and general historical context when we're looking at the poem. Same with Wilfred Owen's poem. We think of the First World War in very general terms, and that really risks flattening the whole historical narrative. The second is trauma theory foundations. I'm referring to works by Carruth and also Le Capra, and thinking about how trauma literature is really a way for people who are traumatized to address and to find a channel to address what they didn't know existed and didn't know how to express. So literature has this way as a channel for people who are influenced and traumatized to express themselves. And also, like Capra pointed out, the non-linearity of trauma narrative, because it's not just a way of acting out when you're experiencing the event. It's also a way for you to work through your emotions. And this is the kind of task and also work that poetry is doing. And I'm referring to poetry because this is the context of this presentation, but really it extends to all literature. And given that we understand trauma narrative as ongoing, as working through our feelings, working through our trauma, then it makes sense for us to construct something that I would like to call the trauma continuum, which is we're not just traumatized by a single bombing. When we write about that specific bombing, we are actually thinking of all the previous bombings that has ever happened. And whenever a future bombing happens, people will find an emotional outlet in the past event. Last but not least, digital hermeneutics. In 2020, Alberto Romilli published a book, titular work called Digital Hermeneutics, where he argues that digital media not only reflects how change the way how we understand knowledge, but it also reflects how we understand knowledge. And through this rack system, I would like to also reflect and respond to that by saying, once we can look at historical interaction between poems, we will be able to think differently about the poems, and we let the digital tools and approaches affect our understanding of history as well. So here I'm building on earlier works, not only Roberto Milli, but also my own work on thinking about how a digital distant pattern showcase can help us we can remove ourselves from the close reading and the selectiveness that we so very often find ourselves in. And here we're working with the conflict archive on the internet called CAIN. It's one of the best known archive on the Troubles. And also it has a variety of information, not just stories on the archive. And the reason why we're not developing our own data is really because what Rosenzweig published in 2003, the problem of data scarcity or abundance. I believe that we do not face the problem of data scarcity. We do not need more data. The problem is really with data abundance and how we select them and use them meaningfully. So this is just a very quick illustration of how the Troubles poems who have known connections to specific events, we tend to read them in that same light. Now, in order to do what I've been proposing so far, I was thinking of something that will help us discover pattern on a much larger scale. We also want to minimize hallucination. And we want to make sure that the results are traceable and targeted. We know exactly what's going on. We don't want it to be a black box. And naturally, RAG is our solution. So I'm sure a lot of you have already known about RAG or have been working with RAG, but this is just a very quick summary of how RAG works. We prepare the data, which usually comes with, it can be either metadata or anything that we gather, we structure them, and then we embed them. We pass them through a vector-based embedding model, and then after the embedding, we can curate where the query is again embedded, and we will have the retrieved results from the database. And very often the augmented generation part is completed by the LM, which uses the output of the retrieved results as an augmentation, as a context to form their analysis or responses. So today we'll mostly be looking at the retrieval part and the data preparation. Now, apparently the advantages of RAG is accuracy and currency. Accuracy, I would say this is used really on a comparative term because no one can say it's fully accurate, especially when we also think about hallucinations. Currency, definitely, it's easy to update the database. It doesn't take training the whole language model again. It also has considerable transparency. As long as you chunk it carefully, you can tell exactly where you got the data and you can manually cross-check with your raw data. And finally, efficiency. Because the embedded vector will be stored in the database, you can query that rather quickly. That means you don't need to go through your whole text again. So we're going to cover some of the limitations in the later part of this presentation. But since we're at King's, I'm sure everyone wants to know about the more digital stuff, and here it is. In terms of methodology, we're using the archive K. This is how it looks. It's year-based, and it was directed and initiated by Ulster University together with the Linen Hall Library and Queen's University, all of them in Belfast in 1997, so just a year before signing the Good Friday Agreement. Now we'll say more about the origin of CAIN in the Q&A part. This is the digital archive, and it has an array of information there related to the Troubles. And we decided that we would like to search this archive based on events rather than the sentiments, which was the original idea. Originally, I was trying to see how can we find the stylistic characteristics of Irish literature by looking at the sentiments. But later we figured that using events description that may imply certain sentiment is actually a relatively more objective way for us to navigate this very complex kind of data in terms of historical context. So we use the archive, we use the summary of the key major events as a proof of concept. And here we've selected 9 poems from a set of 138 poems from the Troubles archive, and we plot them against the year they were written, just as a start. Some of these involve very famous poems. Some of these are lesser known, but nonetheless, we know they're connected to specific events. And second, we plot them to see whether there are poems that we know to be directly responding to or inspired by specific events. So, for example, we see a poem called Ceasefire, directly responding to the Bloody Friday and also the Derry March. We have the Belfast Confetti, which involved multiple killings that is related to the Derry March. So just a quick bit about the LM generation part. Originally, we wanted to use the LMs, but even in the ideation stage, we noticed there could be multiple hurdles. The first is the identifying the limitations that LMs are still not good with working with language nuances. So this is our results testing whether LLMs can understand the nuances of Irish literature. Now, interestingly, with Irish literature, very often you can't really put your finger on a specific word that makes you feel sad or somber. But once you read it, there's just this feeling that's really aching you. And very often we need to tag the poem as neutral because it tends to have, say, a positive beginning, sad ending, or a very sad opening, but a very promising ending. And from our result, from our machine learning result, it shows that none of the LLMs that we've worked with can successfully identify the neutral ones, which is really the more nuanced ones. So we gave up on using LLMs for sentiment and also for literary criticism of our poems. Instead, we collected the summary of key events in the form of JSON. And because Kane uses Java rather than straight HTML for all of their data, it required extra effort to get all of this data and to structure them. So the website is actually very delicately and thoughtfully designed. But I'd say once we start working with the data, there are things that will pop up that wasn't previously noticeable. For example, we noticed that several names in the metadata is actually missing the name of the event. And also the dates of the events, they are wrongly tagged for some reason. So this only shows how difficult and challenging it is to ensure that an archive has been meticulously tagged in all places so that we can work with them seamlessly. This is not a specific critique. This is really just a general observation for anyone who wants to and will be working with an archive. So very quickly for the RAG, we use the E5 embedding model after considering other options as well. We initially wanted to use OpenAI, but unfortunately, first of all, it's not open source, and also it tends to be rather unstable. Because our idea is to make sure this is available to people who want to use it, stability is one of our top priority, as well as semantic robustness. So after much consideration and testing, we wanted to use something that is most up to date and also powerful, as well as open source. So E5 model was our final choice. SBERT was also very good, but we felt it's not as new as E5 model, and also in terms of dimension, it's almost half the size of E5 model. So we used this. Unfortunately, even after multiple tests, we noticed that there are still some issues with stability with E5 model because it has so much dependencies. You may one day notice that the notebook that's been running so well suddenly doesn't work again because there's some upgrades in NumPy or even Python itself. So this is an ongoing issue for all of our digital humanities project. In terms of chunking, we are just doing direct chunking because the size, the tokens of the paragraphs is not too long. And we are doing cosine similarity. We also consider doing a comparison between Euclidean similarity scoring and cosine similarity. But then we decide the difference is not significant, and also cosine similarity seems to be more intuitive for someone to understand because the higher the score indicates the closer the similarity, whereas Euclidean will be the reverse. So we're sticking with cosine similarity here. And this is how we query the data. We basically just ask them help us identify historical events that this poem is related to, and then we just post this poem onto it. Now, for someone who from the literature field, you will definitely find fault with this spacing because in poetic analysis, the spacing and the stanzas are very important. But this is something we need to give up at the moment and just to focus on the event description. And also notice how I didn't reinforce a linear historical event identification. That means whatever historical events seem similar to this will be identified, whether or not it happened before the poem. And that is because I really want to see the whole non-linear and cumulative interconnected trauma narrative that is available. So in terms of findings, we kept it to 9 poems and also only the 5 top Ks to make sure it's manageable so that we can have meaningful findings. This is a table that we compiled, and to make it much easier to navigate, we also visualize it. And also earlier, we were just talking about how, very often we'll see on the paper or anywhere, even on PowerPoint, something like this, and we'll feel happy because we feel there's some kind of visualization. But really, if you try to navigate it, you can't really see what exactly is the notes or just doing. I added an arrow. So the arrow pointing towards the next node will indicate the direction of influence. But still, I don't think this is satisfactory enough. So this is what I did instead. I also created an interactive JavaScript that will allow us to see directly which ones are the nodes that have been influencing and influenced by or echoing the different poems. So we can see the similarity score here, and also we can see the direction. So if I just zoom out a little bit, you will notice that there are multiple notes. For example, this is one of the more significant notes because it connects with a lot of the other poems as well as other events. But the most valuable part of this, well, this is just fun to have, the HTML presentation. But what's most important with this finding is really we see how different poems, they're not just being influenced by the specific historical context that we thought and have been limited to when we're doing the analysis. And I'm going to show this to you in a minute. So I've picked 2 poems for closer reading and study of the result, just to elucidate my point. The first one is by Seamus Dean. The second is also by Seamus, but another Seamus. So Seamus Dean wrote this, published this in 1972. And this title is called After Derry 30 January 1972. Now, with a title like this, we assume that the reg is going to retrieve something with Derry. So we ran 2 tests. The first test is we include the title, which suggests this is about a specific event, just to encourage reg to give us that query result. But because we notice it does catch the result with the word Derry, we also did another run where the title is removed. We want to see how accurately can it detect this. Now, the Derry March resulted in the killing of 13 men. So reportedly, they were marching peacefully, but then the URC the British constables, they shot these men, most of them killed with just one shot to the head or their trunks. So most of the reading would directly link this to the Derry March killing. But what we've been missing here, if we look at this is the top K, the top 5 results. The first one, we actually have civil rights. And in the middle, we have Bloody Friday, Bloody Sunday, with a lot of killings of children as well as other civilians. And the fifth result is the Derry March that we have been looking at. And interestingly, the reason why we have the civil rights in the first one is obviously because there is a mentioning of Derry. But in the fifth one, we have this result not because we have Derry in the search result, which was very encouraging. And what illuminates our reading is that this is not just about Derry March per se. The reason why we have Bloody Friday and Bloody Monday and Bloody Sunday is because we actually have a lot of somber descriptions of death, and not just of the man's death. We also have images of children who might be dying and looming death around the city. So this shows that this poem is really not just a direct reflection of what happened in Derry that specific day, but really it shows how it's an accumulation of early events, starting from the civil rights, which was 4 years ago. The second one, contrarily, it doesn't really talk about death, whereas Seamus Dean's poem is usually interpreted in relation to killing. This one, by Seamus Dean, published in 1975, called Whatever You Say, Say Nothing, really illustrates the political circumstances back then during the Troubles. So everyone was supposed to say whether you are unionist or a Republican. But the trouble with Seamus Heaney is that he was very famous back then already. And North was allegedly his most pronounced work where he says something about the troubles in the North. So this poem has been traditionally interpreted in the context and the framework of political gagness, how you're not supposed to say anything while you feel like you need to say something. So I'm quoting here the first section and the third section. You can see something like besieged within the siege, whispering walls. Everyone can only secretly share what they're thinking, what they're feeling, but not openly so. But contrarily, you're expected to say something because Seamus Heaney was famous. But if you say something, you will be attacked. And you cannot say, for example, there were a lot of Irish Anglo poets and civilians who felt that they are neither nor. And as someone coming from Hong Kong, I actually empathize with this a lot because we grew up in a colonial state. And we also went through the post-colonial period. And you will feel you're neither part of English nor not part of English. And that's just how, the whole environment was like. But this is not something you can safely say in the Northern Ireland context. So for this reason, this poem has been read with that very heavy political indication. And here we have the search results showing the civil rights 1968. So this is one of the things that, the 1968, which correctly captured the whole situation where people were not expected to say explicitly their political senses. But interestingly, in this result, if we could zoom in a little bit, you will see how apart from civil rights, this is the Bloody Friday, or this is another civil rights march. Apart from the civil rights march, we actually have the first one, the most similar one is actually one of the most known bombings happened in 1996. This is very interesting because whenever we think about whatever you say, say nothing, we never really think about the somberness of mass killing during the Troubles. But this led us to take a closer look at this long poem. And this is the last part of the poem where it explicitly talks about people being killed during the Troubles. And I was both surprised and not at all surprised by the result, because this is what we're trying to find. But what surprised me is there has been so much discussion. This is a really famous poem in the context of Irish Troubles. Never have we really seen something that talks about the poem from a non-political point of view, from a more humanistic point of view. And what's most interesting is the part about the killing topped the list of the 5 search results, even though clearly the rest are all very political. So this suggests to me, and also to our team, that while close reading has its own value, very often because we become so selective and we're so engaged in this whole literary historiography building, we may not be able to escape from the pre-established framework. We just feel compelled we need to stick to that narrative. Whereas with this AI augmented and enhanced reading, we now have evidence to say, look, this is why we should also consider this as a reflection on all of the previous killings, because we obviously have something that's reflecting on that. And this is not just political. So with the graphs that we have looked at and also the 2 poems, a quick reading, I would like to argue that the RAG approach allowed us a contextual enrichment precisely because it's emotionless. It doesn't know existing frameworks. All it knows is the semantic similarity. And also it helps paint a fuller tapestry of the Troubles. There are times when the civil rights is where the attention goes, or times where bombing and killing is where the attention goes. But what we're seeing here is always a mix. There are things happening beneath. And also history is not linear, because we see events happening in the future actually share similar semantic information with the poems that were written in the past. And finally, it helps us reconsider lesser known events that are nonetheless key references and key influences to the poems, as shown in the network. So here are a few key takeaways. It helps us read trauma as a continuum based on the findings we have. It should be a mosaic of ongoing trauma where people are inspired by multiple events, as well as providing outlet for people in the future to reflect and express their own feelings. In terms of literary and critical implications, this is an AI augmented close reading, which addresses the concern where AI will take over humanist researches. And this makes the argument where AI should only augment close reading, and this is how it can be done. It also helps us uncover the hidden connections. This is a critical caution that we also came across, the hermeneutic filter. We need to decide which retrieved facts genuinely illuminate the text. There are several times we need to pass through the data again because the result simply didn't make sense. And then it leads us back to the raw data, and we notice something is going on with the metadata. And this, as I mentioned, challenges also the notion that AI can only be used for distant reading. And it encourages us to think about how we can leverage AI for even better close reading. So just a very quick word on some methodological challenges and considerations. Now, first of all, apparently something like RAG, just like training any other models and interacting with any models, it's highly dependent on the data that we have. And data, as we all know, cannot be perfect. We can only try best to be perfect. So what I'm saying this is because we notice that there are key events identified on Cain, whereas from what we know, the Troubles is filled with multiple mini bombings in different areas. So this is a comparison with the description during the very much here. This is from Wikipedia, and as you can see, it details a lot of the mini events that's happening. And also we noticed two key events during the Troubles are missing from the cane, for example, Battle of the Bogside and also Dublin airport bombing. But the thing is, the reason why we didn't choose Wikipedia is because it's more descriptive and it doesn't have the multiple documentary support and cross listings as Kane did. But this is a problem because Wikipedia is apparently more comprehensive, whereas Kane is more informative, though more selective, precisely because it's handpicked and it has been managed by different engineers. Also, we notice the problem of, or the challenge of efficiency and accuracy. We pass multiple passes on the size for chunking. We even also considered recursive chunking. But with recursive chunking, even though we can enhance the accuracy, we need to decide between the efficiency of model and usage of the token versus the accuracy here. So we decided to stick with the direct chunking because it's sentence sensitive and the passage we're looking at is not too long. But what do we do if we have longer passages? Because recursive embedding is going to take double, if not more, tokens than normal ways or usual ways of chunking. And also embedding qualities. The vector database is something that I feel we are hesitant to talk about, just as how the tokens have been marked in the LLMs, because these relate to infrastructure and it obviously takes a long time for people to work through it. It's labor intensive and it's not something that we have the financial support or the manpower support to work on. But really, if we think of all these infrastructures, the embedding quality really affects the output. So the next step is perhaps to develop an Irish discipline-specific embedding set, even just on a small scale, to enhance the performance. And finally, the bias and perspectives presented by the archive. Once again, this is general, not just one archive specific. Remember how Kane is hosted by Ulster University. It actually also received funding from the UK. So with all due respect, we know that there is an effort in trying to stay neutral. But what do we make of the account of Tony Blair's decision to reconsider the nature of a specific killing? Because it receives funding from the UK, it makes us question the neutrality, even though they try to be really neutral. And I think this is all the question and the challenge that all archives are facing. And these are a few more. Over retrieval, we need to make sure the irrelevant ones are not triggered and then become part of our search results. Temporal projection. While our project encourages a non-linear examination of history, some of the projects may want to have a more linear presentation of the search and of the query search. And also, how exactly can we evaluate the efficiency and accuracy of the search result? I think to this day, this remains a huge problem, the million-dollar question for anyone who's working with RAG. We need to justify how we evaluate it. And from what I have seen, there isn't really a well-built framework for us to evaluate the quality of the RAG retrieval. So here are some ethical and practical implications and concerns. Whenever we're interacting with an archive like this, we always want to make sure we use the data in a non-trivial and non-reductive way, also without sensation, void of sensationalism, privacy and copyright issue, which when you respect them, it kind of becomes a hurdle as well. So how do we balance respect for privacy and academic research and AI democracy? Transparency and traceability. ensuring that your source of data and also how you're processing data remains transparent. And once again, this goes back to copyright issues and ownership, because when you try to stay transparent, you will inevitably need to disclose some of the information, how and whether we can get permission from the respective parties. And finally, an important reminder that there should always be human oversight to govern how the AI is working. So, last page of my PowerPoint slide. I hope this RAG project encourages us to think toward a new digital hermeneutics paradigm, as well as new way of thinking about literary historiography. So this is an effort to combine the computational and the traditional or conventional practice in literary studies, as well as TH. And also, this is a way of closing the gap and expanding the discussion in trauma narrative theory, as well as collective memory, the shaping of collective memory through immediate response through literature, as well as finding expression in retrospect through literature. And methodological innovation combining RAG or close reading rather than purely distant reading. Last but not least, future directions. There's so much we can work from here. Developing hermeneutic toolkits. Also, we want to have distilled models on Irish literature, specifically the troubles, so that we can enhance the LM results. Once we can do that, and also encouraging a more granular reading of literature with AI assistance and without letting AI run wild and let it work its own thing. So here are the references. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll look forward to the Q&A, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.